NATO and Ankara. What does Trump really want? The summit in Ankara has just begun, and it's already clear that money was only the beginning. Trump has just made it clear that if the Allies can't become a capable alliance again, America is ready to leave NATO and switch to bilateral agreements with whatever countries it sees fit. And at the same time, before our eyes, Washington is launching an unprecedented deal with Turkey. Lifting sanctions, the F-35, all the things previous presidents couldn't do. Today we'll break down three things. First, what exactly is Trump demanding from his allies besides money? Their own weapons, replacing American troops with national forces, and full responsibility for Europe's defense except for the nuclear shield. Second, it's about specifics. What are the specific numbers for the reduction of the American military presence in Europe, which is already happening right now, not in the future, but already taking place? And third, why is Trump building a separate personal relationship with Turkey outside the broader alliance framework? And what could this mean for the future of NATO? Money, as it turned out, was only the beginning. A year ago, the allies in The Hague agreed to spend 5% of GDP on equipment. Formally, the goal has been achieved. Or rather, they are confidently moving towards it. The European allies and Canada have already reached about 4% of GDP. Not all of them, not everyone, yes, but still. They have spent an additional $1.2 trillion since 2017. So Rutte proudly showed graphs at the press conference before the summit, calling it Trump's trillion. He did the same thing at the White House when visiting Trump. But here's the problem. Trump doesn't react to these graphs the way Rutte expected. In the last days before the summit, he wrote on social media, "It's ridiculous that the U.S. continues down this one-sided path when the relationship is not reciprocal. They weren't with us." Well, and there were a few with negative signs. Well, you know what I'm talking about. About Iran, of course. When Trump struck Iranian targets, some European allies refused to grant the Americans military access to their bases, even though Europe was much closer and more reachable, if such a word exists, by Iranian missiles, to which they could soon start attaching nuclear warheads. This became a personal insult to Trump, and from that moment, Trump's rhetoric changed. His own words were spoken in the Oval Office with Rutte. "Just be loyal. I only need loyalty. We don't need money. We don't need anything at all from them, our NATO partners, right? We have the most powerful army in the world, no doubt, but I need loyalty." This is not a metaphor or a figure of speech. This is a direct statement of a requirement that cannot be expressed with a chart, as even Western analysts covering the summit honestly admit. So what exactly does Trump need, besides money? It's worth breaking down the requirements point by point, because over the past few weeks the picture has become much clearer. The first is weapons. Trump wants allies not just to finance defense, but either to produce weapons themselves or to buy weapons from the U.S. Moreover, if European countries want to buy American weapons and sell them to Ukraine, Washington has no problem with that. In fact, it is even encouraged. At the same time, this supports Kyiv and creates business for the American military-industrial complex. The second point is replacing troop contingents. The idea is that American troops stationed in European countries would gradually be replaced by the national troops of those same countries. This is a direct embodiment of the concept that the Pentagon calls NATO 3.0, 3.0, 3.0. In fact, earlier this year, I believe the Deputy Secretary of Defense, that's Elbridge Colby, spoke about this publicly at a meeting of NATO defense ministers. Europe is taking on leadership, and not just in terms of grand declarations, but also, as the American ambassador to NATO, Matthew Whitaker, put it, in terms of the alliance's moral authority and moral compass. Third, and this is a fundamental point, full responsibility for their own defense. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said directly back at the end of May at the NATO foreign ministers' meeting in Sweden, "Ultimately, there will be fewer American troops in Europe than historically." He didn't say there would be none at all. He said fewer. The U.S. nuclear shield remains in place. Washington has officially stated this and assured its allies that there will be no changes in the nuclear component or in deterrence. But when it comes to conventional armed forces, the logic is simple. If you are attacked, America as a member of the alliance is obliged to respond. But now, the readiness to defend themselves every day without American cover is Europe's own responsibility. And here comes the question, which I will answer a bit later. What will happen if Europe can't handle it? Trump has already made it clear what his next step will be. And this is not some abstract threat, but a very concrete scenario involving bilateral agreements. Now, a separate but revealing issue is Greenland. Trump once again, for the umpteenth time, publicly stated at the forum before the summit that Greenland should be controlled by the U.S., not Denmark. Washington's formal logic is as follows: the concept of homeland defense, meaning the ability to deploy defense facilities on Greenland's territory without coordination with the European Union, if necessary in the interests of American security. Denmark and the European Union do not recognize this position, but Trump persistently raises this issue at every major forum. All this is happening against the backdrop of a broader strategic shift. The Pentagon is shifting its priorities to China and the Indo-Pacific region. That is why submarines, carrier groups, and strategic aviation, the equipment needed specifically to deter China, not for the land defense of Europe, are gradually being moved to the Western Hemisphere. Now, here are the specific concrete reduction figures that have already been confirmed. According to data published in May by Der Spiegel, which is a German magazine, citing a closed briefing by a Pentagon representative for NATO diplomats in Brussels, they were told that the number of strategic bombers allocated to NATO is being cut in half. Well, that means half, right? The number of fighters is down by a third, and there are fewer destroyers. And the American fleet is no longer allocating submarines to NATO at all. We're moving everything here. The Pacific, the so-called Indo-Pacific basin. Now Europe itself has to provide reconnaissance drones and some strike drones as well. Added to this is the withdrawal of about 5,000 American servicemen from the continent and the cancellation of the rotation of an entire armored brigade. How many is that? More than 4,000 soldiers, plus a long-range artillery battalion that was supposed to be sent to Poland. The Supreme Commander of the NATO Joint Forces in Europe, Alexis Grinkovich, said directly in mid-May in Brussels, "Further reductions should be expected as the European pillar of the alliance grows stronger. Like, guys, you have to give more, supply more, while we will withdraw, we will pull out, we will reduce." The official position of the NATO representative, as quoted by the same Spiegel, was that there was excessive dependence on the U.S. in the alliance's military planning. And now when Europe and Canada are investing more, the responsibilities within the alliance need to be reconsidered. But the most interesting things are happening not at the General Summit sessions, but in a separate room where Trump is meeting one-on-one with Erdogan. And there, what's at stake is something that no U.S. president has been able to resolve in the last 7 years. Because Turkey, this is the first visit of an American president to Turkey, I think, since Obama's trip in 2015, and Trump from the very beginning is setting up this meeting not as a routine part of the NATO summit, but as a separate personal channel with Erdogan. A fact that was recorded at the joint press conference on July 7th. Trump announced that Washington is lifting sanctions on Turkey, sanctions that were imposed back in December 2020 after Ankara purchased the Russian S-400 surface-to-air missile system. "We are lifting the sanctions. It's time to do it. We don't want to punish our friends," said Trump. At the same time, he stated that he is considering returning Turkey to the F-35 fighter jet program from which America excluded it because of the S-400 since Turkey bought it from Russia, even though the Turks have already paid about $1.4 billion for 5 planes, which they never received. Trump's wording is telling. Turkey turned out to be much more loyal in many ways than other countries we expected to be loyal. So again, and again, the word loyalty, not money. It's important here to distinguish between fact and speculation. The fact is that Trump publicly announced his intention. What remains uncertain is whether this will actually happen in practice, because legally the situation is more complicated than just the president's wish. The sanctions are established by Congress in law, and the ban on supplying F-35s is separately set out in the 2020 defense budget law. It is clearly stated there that the transfer of fighter jets is only possible after the administration officially determines that Turkey no longer possesses the S-400 system. That is, either they returned it to Russia or they disposed of the equipment. The president can initiate the cancellation, but any such initiative automatically goes to Congress and must also be decided by Congress. There are already Republican senators, like Lindsey Graham and John Cornyn, who have publicly expressed doubts that this will pass. Additional pressure is coming from Israel, on Trump. Netanyahu personally, in an interview with Fox News, called Turkey a country that is run by a man who openly calls for the destruction of Israel. And he stated that transferring F-35As would upset the balance of power in the Middle East. At the same time, Washington has already made some decisions without much difficulty. The sale of engines to Turkey, what are they called? F-110 has been approved. So $700 million. This is for the new Turkish fifth-generation fighter jet. And there's a major lawsuit against the Turkish bank Halkbank, which has been accused for years of bypassing sanctions against Iran. It was quietly closed, with no practical consequences for the bank. And here's an important point, which directly concerns us, those who are following this topic from the Russian-speaking community. If Washington is really turning a blind eye to the S-400 in Turkish hands, well, the Russian system, purchased despite direct U.S. pressure, this creates a precedent, which can influence how America will negotiate with other countries. How will America, in principle, negotiate with other countries? Those who are maneuvering between Moscow and Washington. In a few minutes, I'll explain why this might be more important for the future configuration of forces. In Eastern Europe, than the actual defense budget numbers themselves. The summit is attended by leaders. That means all leaders of all 32 NATO countries separately invited are President Zelensky of Ukraine and the President of South Korea. John Lee Jimin. I like it. I apologize. They are joining the leaders' dinner, but not the main alliance sessions. This symbolically emphasizes that Ukraine's membership in NATO still remains an unrealized prospect. Australia, Japan, New Zealand sent their defense or foreign ministers, just like the Gulf countries. These are Bahrain, Kuwait, and Qatar, whose interests are directly affected by the recent American-Israeli, so to speak, attacks and conflicts with Iran. Trump will hold a separate meeting with Zelensky on Wednesday. Before that, on July 4th, he spoke on the phone with both Zelensky and Putin. He noted, as always, that both sides want to make a deal, although a settlement is unlikely in the near future, even by the end of the year. I made a separate video about this. There are some very interesting prospects on this topic, so check it out. On the one hand, as they say, it's unlikely. On the other hand, there are a lot of signals that something serious might happen by the end of the year. Separately, on the sidelines of the summit, a meeting is planned between Trump and the president of Syria, Ahmed Ashara. I'm not very good with names. The White House did not disclose the agenda, but Trump had previously spoken publicly about a more active role for Syria in confronting Hezbollah in Lebanon. So the summit in Ankara has taken place. It's kind of a moment of truth. It showed that Trump's demands on the allies went far beyond a simple question about GDP percentages. It's about a new architecture for the alliance, where Europe takes on not only financial but also real combat responsibility, and the United States of America builds more selective one-to-one ties with specific countries. It's important to see the main point. The alliance, despite all the tensions, continues to exist. The allies continue to sit at the table. And the volume of real investments in defense has grown in a way it hasn't in the last 30 years. This means that NATO, despite all the turbulence, despite all the disagreements, despite all the problems, has a real chance to come out of this test stronger and more balanced as an alliance than before, just with a different distribution of responsibility between Washington and the European states. So, as a result, of course, there will be, as usual, a short declaration, similar to last year's one in The Hague, with language about ironclad commitments. Commitments to collective defense, and so on. There will be no breakthrough. The declaration will not resolve any controversial issues. The alliance deliberately avoids sharp wording in the final documents. Even now, you can see the friction. Italy is blocking some commitments on Ukraine. In particular, the NATO Secretary General's proposal to allocate 0.25% of GDP to help Kyiv. That's about $120 billion a year. Moreover, Estonia came up with this initiative. There is no consensus on this at all, not even close. My prediction: the summit will end with a demonstration of formal unity, while all the underlying contradictions remain, pretty much the same way as it was in The Hague a year ago. Now, Greenland. A separate, essentially non-NATO question. It will come up, but not in any formal way. It will be discussed, but it won't be formally resolved at the summit, because it's not within the alliance's mandate to resolve it. It's a matter for bilateral relations between the US and Denmark. Although, of course, Europe, not NATO, Europe plays a huge role there, yes, the European Union. Trump will continue to raise this topic, rhetorically, at every forum. But there is no real mechanism for Greenland to come under US control, not right now. Neither legal nor political, but Trump has already gotten general permission to do whatever he wants there, but he just wants to achieve it in a way so that it can't be taken away from him later. That's my prediction. So the topic remains a so-called constant irritant, but without any practical steps in, let's say, the coming months. Now the war with Iran. Here the alliance has a real undeclared split. France publicly criticized Trump's decision to start the war without consultations. Spain refused to let the US use its bases. Germany gave verbal support but publicly expressed dissatisfaction. This is exactly what led Trump to use the phrase about loyalty. My prediction: there won't be any serious change in the Allies' policy on this point. The national positions within the EU on Iran and the Middle East as a whole are too different. At most, there will be targeted gestures, a promise to help ensure the security of shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, but not a unified position. And no one in Europe is going to send their own forces there to be shot at. Israel and the deal with Turkey. Here's the key point. Between Trump's personal relationship with Erdogan and the resistance within the American system itself, Nathaniel publicly spoke out against transferring F-35s to Turkey, calling it a threat to Israel's qualitative military superiority. Added to this is resistance in Congress. Well, the same senators Graham and Cornyn have already expressed doubts, and the law requires official confirmation from Congress that Turkey has physically gotten rid of the S-400. That is, confirmation from the administration, assurance, confirmation that Turkey no longer has this system. Then Congress says, okay, and starts voting. I think Trump will announce the political intention to lift the sanctions and bring Turkey back into the F-35 program. But the implementation will take months, or even years, because it has to go through congressional review. And the final package will most likely be smaller than originally promised. Maybe just those 5 planes they've already paid for. The money, as they say, is sitting in our accounts. Maybe they'll get it. But a full return to the program, at least until the next NATO summit, I don't see it happening. And that means replacing the American presence with a European one, the timing and steps involved. As they say, this is the main highlight of this meeting. This is not a one-time process. Officially, the Pentagon does not specify any exact dates. The reductions have been announced as gradual, But according to actual data, well, for example, Der Spiegel in May, you can see that the process is already underway. Withdrawing about 5,000 troops, canceling rotations, and moving armored brigades, all of this is already happening. What does Europe need to do to actually replace it? So that, well, so to speak, to fill the gap themselves, as they say, right? First of all, they need to build up their own fleet. This means submarines and destroyers. Right now, France, Britain, Germany, Norway, the Netherlands, Spain, and also Italy have submarines, but it's not enough. And there's very weak compatibility between them. They have them, but they don't really communicate with each other. Increase the production of reconnaissance and strike drones. Europe will be able to do this. Perhaps with Ukraine's help, and Ukrainian technologies may already be in use. They are starting production now. Solve the strategic aviation problem. Europe simply doesn't have an equivalent to American strategic bombers. And in the foreseeable future, by the way, there won't be one. To solve the compatibility issue, I mean, that's a huge problem. So it's not so much the hardware anymore, but rather the software, unified data, unified artificial intelligence systems. Europe is lagging behind, even at a low cost. Europe, not even close. Here's my prediction. The realistic time frame for full replacement is at least 50 years 5 to 10, not 55 to 10 years. And in some areas like strategic aviation and aircraft carrier groups, Europe will physically never be able to replace the US. Not because it can't, but because Europe is divided, no matter what they say, into fragments, into separate countries. And not all of them have it. Common goals, although of course they pretend they do. If they don't agree to pool their resources at the top level, at the European Union level, not at the level of individual countries, they won't be able to do anything like that. That is, they could if they were able to tell their people, tighten your belts, but they can't. And that's why, in this sense, these totalitarian countries are winning. Well, how will the Europeans prove their loyalty if they can't do it with submarines and battleships or destroyers, aircraft carriers? Then let's try loyalty. With loyalty, let's check this. So, announcement of contracts worth tens of billions of dollars at the Defense Industry Forum in Ankara. Purchase of American weapons, including with the aim of transferring them to Ukraine. This suits both Kyiv and the American military-industrial complex at the same time. Presentation of concrete and credible national plans to reach 5% of GDP, which Rutte directly demanded. Otherwise, America won't be there, guys. There will be no America if you don't do this. And symbolic gestures like supporting the Turkish deal or joint statements on the Strait of Hormuz. Joint statements. They aren't worth much. There's another scenario called promise and forget. We've been talking all this time about Iran doing this, but it's not just Iran that's doing it. This is not a hypothetical risk. This is an observable pattern of behavior of the alliance, the NATO alliance, a historical precedent.
Precedent.
The commitment of 2% of GDP was made in Wales in 2014. In reality, 32 countries only reached this level by 2025. Under whose pressure? So the implementation stretched over 11 years. Now, according to the data, in preparation for the summit, a number of countries, Spain, the United Kingdom, the Czech Republic, Slovenia, Hungary, they are not showing a significant increase in spending since last year, and they risk not reaching the target by 2035. But even now, before the pressure from Trump eases, who will be gone by that time, yes, they are already showing that they were just paying lip service. Plus, there's a structural factor. Alongside the promise to increase purchases from the U.S., the European Union is simultaneously promoting the Buy European program. Starting from 2025, there are rules requiring at least 65% of defense equipment purchases under the program from European manufacturers. In other words, they don't produce it. So what are they supposed to buy then? Besides, this directly contradicts the logic of buy more from America and creates a situation where, with less personal pressure from Trump, Europe will return to prioritizing its own defense industry. Well, here's my direct conclusion. Yes, the option to make promises under Trump and quietly back down when the pressure eases is not just possible, but historically it's NATO's standard pattern of behavior, specifically regarding financial commitments. We'll make promises, but we won't deliver. The only difference now is that for the first time, the demand for real combat independence has been added to the financial pressure. And that's much harder to fake with paperwork. Because either a country has a capable army and equipment, or it doesn't. As they say, it's one of three options. Despite all the harsh rhetoric and the real cracks we've talked about today, it's important to see the main thing. The alliance continues to function and change, not fall apart. 32 leaders sat down at the same table again, despite all the predictions about NATO's demise. Of course, it was Trump who saved NATO from demise. Maybe Putin helped a little too. So for the first time in decades, Europe has truly taken its own defense seriously. And not just in words, but in real budgets and real factories, real production. Even the friction with Washington, despite how sharp it is friction between allies, not enemies. And the argument is about who pays how much for the shared home, not whether this house is needed at all. Although Trump keeps saying, we'll leave. The history of NATO is the history of an alliance that has always found the strength to adapt to a new world. After the Cold War, after September 11, after Crimea, nothing suggests that this time will be any different. Ankara is not the end of the road. It's just one stage in the alliance's restructuring to fit reality. Not fantasy, but reality. Well, as for the one who gives them a dose of reality, naturally, ladies and gentlemen, that person is hated. But tell me the name of this person. Out of the three. Guess. Actually, Europe is getting stronger. Transatlantic relations on more equal terms. And that's good news. That's good news. A strong, independent Europe within a strong NATO is exactly what the founders of the alliance aimed for 77 years ago. That's all. Let's say goodbye and see you next time.